kind of to follow on that, obviously we look through everything with a digital asset mining kind of a lens to these policies. We're onto a new year here. We're up to an election year here. Um, kind of we could start high level. What you see would be top of mind energy policy for this year, and then obviously the $1 million question is that if anything's going to happen in this next year. But then if you can kind of maybe highlight a piece or two of what we should be focusing on here as an industry and where we could possibly engage on some of these policies, Capitol Hill, and within throughout the government.
Yeah, so great question. So I think there will be a lot of activity in the energy policy arena in 2024. It may not be on the legislative side, but certainly, on the regulatory front, there's going to be a lot happening. Anytime you're heading into a presidential election year, the incumbent administration is always trying to get policy out the door that they hope to have in place, even should they lose the election. So I think there'll be a lot of activity out of the various agencies in the Biden administration. The big focus in Congress, when it comes to energy, I think there are still some serious efforts on permitting reform. I, for one, while I would love to see some legitimate traction on permitting reform, I think the politics around it are pretty tough, particularly in a election year, but it's necessary because the reality is we have to build a lot more energy infrastructure in this country, both when it comes to traditional resources, things like natural gas plants and natural gas pipelines, as well as building out the transmission that's necessary to get clean energy onto the grid. And so I think one of the big focuses this coming year that you guys should at least as big energy consumers pay attention to is what FERC is going to do when it comes to transmission planning and transmission reforms. We really need to build a lot of transmission in this country in order to ensure that we have the requisite power in place to meet this increasing pressure on demand and the forward curve for load increases. If you look at where a lot of the clean energy and renewable capacity is in this country, it's in places where you don't have sufficient demand to warrant it. So we need to build transmission to get that power to where the demand centers are. And the reality is it's just really, really hard to build things in this country. I was screaming this from the rooftops during my waning days at FERC because it's an interesting dynamic that we have right now in that the historical opponents of building energy infrastructure, because it was largely fossil infrastructure, have become the proponents of building transmission to get clean energy onto the grid. But I was trying to tell these very same folks that they could not tie up the process for building natural gas pipelines in bureaucratic red tape and legal obstacles and not expect those same obstacles to come into place when it comes to building transmission. Because the reality is NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, is not political. It's not ideological. Americans don't want energy infrastructure coming through their backyards, whether it's a pipeline to deliver gas or a transmission line to deliver clean energy. So it's just really, really hard to build things in this country. Getting transmission lines sited is going to be a huge challenge. The reality is if we wanted to site transmission lines in the most expeditious way possible, we would use existing right-of-ways. But then that brings up moral questions of, are we subjecting the very same communities who went through the last round of infrastructure build-out to have more infrastructure come through their properties and not neighboring communities? Now, as an academic case, I could probably credibly argue that here, yes, I'm sorry, community, we're going to be coming through and building in your backyard again. But this time, we're going to build a transmission line that will put clean energy onto the grid, that will retire a higher polluting source of generation, that will ultimately, over time, clean up your air and water. As an academic case, maybe you could make that argument. As a real-world political one, very, very difficult to argue to those communities that they should be subject to another round of infrastructure build-out. Then the real tricky, thorny question and issue is over who pays for all of this. How do you allocate the costs for building out these huge, high capex, risky projects? And the reality is you're going to have states in the middle. And what happens to those states in the middle? So you've got state A that say has a lot of renewable resources that they want to be able to deliver, and you have state C that has a lot of demand and wants those renewable sources of power and wants additional capacity. What happens to state B in the middle? State B's ratepayers don't benefit from the generation nor the consumption of that power. They're going to have transmission lines coming through their backyards. Now, as an academic argument, I could make the case that ratepayers in state B do benefit from alleviated transmission congestion, which is a huge issue, and therefore they ought to bear some of the cost of building this long haul transmission line. Again, as an academic exercise, you could make that argument. As a real life one, really, really, really hard to tell ratepayers in state B that you are going to have a transmission line come through your backyard that you don't want, that you're not going to benefit from the generation of the power nor the consumption, but we're going to make you pay for it too, for part of it. Very, very hard to do. And I say all this is my long-winded senatorial way of saying what FERC has before it is really, really challenging. And my former colleagues are going to do what they can to kind of reform this process, but it's not going to be easy. It's going to be subject to a ton of legal challenges, and we pretty thorny, which is why, I think FERC acting alone isn't going to solve, these issues around ensuring that we have the grid of the future in place. I do think it will take, a combination of FERC activity plus permitting reform. To me, I think there is a deal to be had in which we could better, align the process for the approval of natural gas infrastructure. We're going to need natural gas for the foreseeable future to maintain reliable and affordable electricity delivery in this country. We need more pipelines in more regions of the country so that natural gas can play that critical role. And simultaneously, we should make it easier to build transmission in this country. There's a reasonable deal to be had, but the politics around it are really thorny. Why this is critical for members of the Digital Energy Council is that, you guys are big consumers of energy. And as consumers of energy, you're going to want to ensure that you've got reliable power that is there when you need it at a reasonable and a just and reasonable cost. And I think it's going to take getting this infrastructure in place to ensure that you can maintain that reliability and affordability. And so this is going to be, these are issues that will go, years into the future. But I do think that transmission in particular, permitting reform, looking at reforming the gas pipeline approval process will all be front and center in 2024.